Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and this is episode 96. The topic is iShare, bringing trust to data with JWT-Based Access Control. Quick bit of housekeeping. If you want to support the live stream, please follow the live stream on LinkedIn. Our guest today is Rajiv Rajani, CTO of iShare Foundation. Welcome, Rajiv.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for a wonderful introduction. And hello, everyone who has joined. My name is Rajiv. I'm CTO of iShare Foundation.
And Rajiv, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we go into iShare Foundation? How'd you get here?
Yes. Well, I have background in or master. I've done masters in information technology, so I have been studying that as a topic as well. And I myself started as a developer, did various roles in IT industry, did development work, building applications, specifically focusing on integrations between applications. So all time moving data from point A to point B. Of course, then I moved into more architectural roles and more management roles, as well as then consulting enterprise architects. So these kind of roles gave me broader perspective in terms of application landscape within enterprise, but also beyond the enterprise, where the focus of iShare is specifically is outside your organizational boundaries. So bringing it all together in that perspective.
I think our audience doesn't know a lot about iShare, so I wanted to start a little bit with just a little bit of background on iShare. So what is iShare? What business problem does iShare solve? And what are some of the challenges around data sharing across enterprise boundaries?
Okay. So first, I'll make a statement about iShare. So iShare is a framework. It is a framework to create or enable data rights holders to get control over their data. And by that, I mean not only control in terms of who has access to their data, but also controls in terms of what the receiver of the data can do with it. The reason why we started iShare, maybe a bit of history, is we started in Netherlands, and in Netherlands there was, of course, a lot of talks in terms of bringing efficiencies in logistics, because you see there are a lot of half-empty trucks or one-sided loaded trucks while empty trucks returning back, and inefficiencies in a lot of transportation. And the sector and the government together wanted to come up with a solution to bring efficiencies, reduce carbon emissions with climate agreements and all those kind of things, but also looking at smart cities or smart environments, bring how all of that into perspective. A lot of solutions are proposed where a common platforms or data lakes kind of solutions, where every organization is actually asked to put their data, so that you can work on the data and come up with a solution out of it. But as you can imagine, that solution is not feasible in real world. None of the businesses would like to put their data somewhere else and hope that it can guide how to run their business. So
Like customer lists, et cetera, and addresses, so there's a lot of confidential information in there, right?
Yes, indeed, and competition sensitive, and a lot of issues around that. So we needed a solution which could work without actually putting all your data out, and only share required data, but at the same time, not only about sharing, but also to control what the use of the data can be, because we have seen misuse of data a lot in a broader world. And that is one of the key aspects that we learned from the market as well, that the trust was missing in that perspective.
Great. And when
That
you say, so you want to scope the data so that it can be used for its specific purpose, but nothing more, and only for the exposed for the time of that it's needed to be exposed. So you can see the customer order while you're working on it, but after that, it doesn't hang around, right?
indeed, that's one of the examples. Yes. And that led to, of course, creation of iShare framework, which is essentially a framework, but not a centralized infrastructure or a platform, where the framework actually enables decentralized data sharing. So you keep your data at the source. You just open up access to the data at the source instead. And for that, of course, you need identification, authentication, authorization, and with valid authorizations and controls in terms of who is authorized and what are the conditions for authorizations and usage. They are all encompassed through this framework. The other aspect that this framework brings is the legal coverage, because technical enforcements can happen to a certain extent. There are use cases where it cannot happen, or it is built by software. Software can have bugs. So purely relying on technical enforcement does not always work in all cases. However, legal is something that needs to happen every time. So this framework already incorporates that for all the participants or users of this framework, that they can actually rely on the first step as a legal, and then additionally, where they require, they can actually have the technical enforcement of usage conditions as well.
It's sounding a lot like a federation. You know, we say tools and rules. So the tools is the technical part, the rules is the legal. And so, but you're not talking about a federation, you're talking about a framework where you're saying, you know, we have a number of ecosystems in the EU, one of which is logistics, but there's also, you know, let's say travel or, you know, other industries.
Yes.
So here's a framework where we're going to define a way we're going to define a, let's say even a token format, let's say,
Mhm.
and we're going to give you sort of a template for how you build a federation. And now ecosystems, you go and actually build your federations and figure out what rules and schema you need for your specific federation. Does that sound reasonably right?
Yes, I would say so. Though we don't use the term federation here, more in Europe, it's more called data spaces or data ecosystems. But I
Uh-huh.
think they are having the similar intentions and meanings. The idea is that, of course, you as an ecosystem, maybe it is sectoral or it is cross-sectoral, but regional, or in specific verticals or horizontals. Uh, as long as there are organizations or parties who are interested in doing something together for common purpose, in the sense that, for business enablement. Let's take an example of logistics, where optimization of transport needs to happen. Then the whole supply chain, or the whole supply chain of logistics, must be involved in that process. And in order to have that streamlined across, you need to define some of the things on the standard level, so that everyone implements it, which has then ability for those parties who are involved to actually harness the advantage that this definitions will bring to them. And the framework is aiming at starting such kind of ecosystems or federations. And the framework itself is not a federation, nor is our foundation a federation, uh, because our foundation is a neutral entity and a not-for-profit organization. Our aim is, the foundation is just set up to govern the framework, or help evolve the framework. And our governance is actually by our participants themselves. So they actively take part in how we develop the framework further. What aspects do we consider in the framework? How do we guide other participants or other ecosystems to apply this framework? How can they interact and interoperate with them, when specifically talking cross-sectoral? Because manufacturing, logistics, finance, agriculture, all of them also has cross interactions. And using the framework, they have the ability to um, interact with others and have interoperable cross data spaces, data sharing use cases. Sorry. So
I want to go into more detail on the tool side of this in a second, but I have I want to jump to the end. Were you able to solve your logistics problem? Did you get more goods onto trucks in both directions by using the solution?
Yes, this is actually a solution which is adopted, and there are now on a larger scale, the initiative is being bought out in because iShare has a specific focus in terms of identification, authentication, authorization, and the legal aspects surrounding it. But we didn't. What we are agnostic towards is the specific data things. So in logistics, of course, you need multimodality and standardization or interoperability across modalities, specific data models, and semantic interoperability and all those aspects. So now that using iShare as a basis, a broader for logistics world is being created and is going to be the standard that every logistical company who works in Netherlands will end up implementing that. But on the first level, there were a lot of pilots done and a lot of actual use cases implemented using iShare, and they all worked very well. Yes.
Okay,
And that
so
was the
more.
base. Also expand into other sectors in agriculture, in construction, in energy. So yeah.
It's not often when you can say our work in IT directly resulted in less emissions. So we should just celebrate that for a second.
Yes, and the for analogy, the challenge is it's if it was just within an enterprise boundary and we were talking about one company where we had to implement that, we would have been succeeded a long ago. But this is all ecosystem, so it's not it just doesn't work if one organization implements it. It works based on a network effect. So you need more parties in order to have this organized in a way that and that's why I said this is on ecosystem level and not something specific to organizations. More organizations, when they implement, they are able to interact with each other, and then they can harness this power to actually streamline their operations.
Yeah, and I think we need more of these. I call them federations. I think we need more of these in general to just to get more collective organizing ability in the B2B space. I want to drill into the access management area. So you mentioned that these are very tricky access management challenges, like how which data can you access and for how long. Before, so eventually, it sounds like you came up with some way to say, in order to get access to this, you need to present a token or a bundle of tokens with some certain contents. But before you got to that solution, what were some of the other things that got tried, or was there just no idea how to solve it?
Yeah, so well, we looked at all the traditional ways of doing authorizations, and we looked at all the standards, including OAuth and others that have been traditionally used. The primary, well, when we talk about outside your organization boundaries, that's usually happening with APIs or those kind of integration patterns, where you usually have API keys or to some extent some other kind of registrations or based on some private certificates. So those all evaluation options were evaluated, and we came across that you need it's not secure enough because if you share your secret to somebody else, then that person or party already has that access, and then you lose the control in terms of who has now access to the data and what they are doing with your data, because that was the key problem. So we needed all kinds of assurances in terms of that the data that is being shared is shared with the right party. And that's why we looked at, okay, how can we actually make digital proofs of things of each transaction that are happening, and that led to us to actually tokenize everything in that sense. So we extended these protocols in that perspective to bring tokenization aspects for every exchange that you do in terms of authorizations or identification aspects, and also the data.
And so I imagine each ecosystem has different information or schema.
Yeah.
Does the framework allow you to define your own schema?
Yes, in terms of data, it's actually just the structure of the payload and not actual semantics. So semantics are basically the payload has all the free text essentially, so you are able to choose your own vocabulary as you want to use, as long as the parties who are in the transaction can understand that, because otherwise you send A and the other party interprets that C. That will not help. You need to have an alignment between yourself. It's just the the framework defines only the container where you are actually describing things, but the description itself is something between that you decide essentially.
I see. So the schemas at an ecosystem level. Each ecosystem is going to define their own, and they'll need agreement there.
Yeah.
You mentioned in our chat room right before the episode that you're neutral. That your framework doesn't tell anything about what policy syntax should be used to describe policies. Um, but given that, do you have any thoughts on sort of what you see out there, people using, and or other thoughts about policy syntax as someone who's seen a bunch of them?
Yes, so there are quite a lot of policy languages, and each sector has differences in terms of where they stand in terms of adoption of specific policy language models, like SAML, XSEML, ODRL. These are some of the most regularly used ones that we have seen. There are new policy languages which are also being defined or being utilized. And there are, of course, a lot of processing engines or processing languages, or with linked data or RDF models. There are plenty of them that are being made available through a lot of standardization works. Eh, and in that perspective, what I mentioned earlier, we only define the container to for interaction between the parties, and we don't define how we actually the language is then language to define the policies, and agnostic towards how you share that information with others. And that helps in making the interoperability bridge between the two organizations, because I could use say policy language X, and another company could use policy language Y. But if I'm sharing the issue or the subject, the common elements across in a standardized way to them, then they have a way to interpret it and apply it within their own policy rules engine. That helps in making sure interoperability is there while not throwing away your existing implementations.
Yeah, I think so. You're saying we're defining the inputs, the possible inputs to the policy, but not how you actually define the policy.
Yes.
Although the federation, each ecosystem federation might want to have, you're saying at the same time, we do actually want them to define policies to enable that the data is only allowed for what it's used for. But they define those policies in legal terms, I guess, in the rules. And then they leave it up to each of the organizations to figure out how to implement that in code. Does that sound right?
Yeah, indeed. That's a way we look at it as well, and that's how we see everyone wants it as well.
So the first most important policy language is English.
Yeah, unless it's a regional one, then it's a regional language.
Yeah. Okay. What else did I want to talk about? So how I've heard some people say that it's hard to coalesce these ecosystems to action. Um, And what's your experience been like? You have a lot of autonomous enterprises. What are some of the challenges around catalyzing these ecosystems to do something?
Yes, yeah, indeed, it can be challenging, is what we have seen. However, of course, with this kind of frameworks and structures and a lot of examples that we have already now, including governments, by the way, who are looking at these and adopting these kind of frameworks and trying to implement or bring a solution towards the market. There is more and more acceptance by organization now, because they do see value in standardizing some of the aspects that are regularly part of your value chains, upstream, downstream. You would rather want it standardized because if you are working on a specific value chain, some of your players are using standard A, but some other players are using standard B. That means either you can connect to them or you cannot connect to them, ideally, which requires a lot of effort on your side to update your IT, or either on their side it requires to update their IT to support the other standard as well. So trying to bring an alignment there, and they all see the benefits, of course, in having the ability to connect to a lot more upstream and downstream parties, so that they can actually take a lot of advantage from the operationalization or efficiencies in operationalizations.
I heard one in the aerospace industry. We were involved in trying to start a federation here at Glue. And one of the challenges is that the aerospace company, the federation wasn't a project that had a start date and an end date. It was an effort almost that was going to go on indefinitely. Do you see that friction at all when trying to coalesce some of these ecosystem federations?
Um, Luckily, no, not most of them. Yeah, I know there are some examples of similar nature. However, no. Luckily, we have always um, bought the perspective that this has to be in a sustainable way, and we work together with all the parties to make sure that they also set up a governance of their own ecosystem or of their own federation, in that sense that it becomes sustainable, and they are the ones who are actually making the decision. But it's also the governance is created by the participants themselves. So it's not like a third party who is doing all the controls, but it's actually their own inputs, and their own buy-in is guaranteed, because they are the ones who are actually defining how they would like this ecosystem to develop, and how it should further be governed and kept sustainable. So in that process, that already helps them to see, yes, this goes in a long running way and doesn't stop after the project ends. Of course, one of the key aspects is that for such an initiative, then it has to be an open initiative where more parties can join, and it has to be more transparent in terms of how participants are able to join, how they are able to participate in it, what roles they can play in it, and how the interactions between all the participants are organized. Those are a few of the aspects that needs to be catered. But once that is catered, I see that there's more and more adoption of belongingness there.
Is this an EU initiative, or if developing nations had ecosystems that maybe wanted to coalesce, could they come to iShare and reuse this framework?
Yes, so iShare since inception has a guiding principle that it has to be international, and it has to be generic. So these are two of the primary principles on which iShare is developed as a framework. Of course, but we are very pragmatic. So we start where we go in terms of whatever is ready and whatever is working in the current market. We just apply that, we learn from that, and evolve that into the next stage. So we started back in Netherlands. Now it's in European wide. A lot of organizations across Europe are using it, and we are also looking at how international outside EU organizations are going to leverage. There have been pilots done in some of the other countries outside Europe as well using iShare, and the response has been positive. However, of course, when it comes to international, and because we also deal on legal and other aspects, these are the things where we need more attention and focus in terms of bringing that alignment across different regions. But since inception, we have had the intention to go fully global and create a framework for complete international use as well.
Hmm. Is there one iShare participant agreement, or is there does each industry develop its own participant agreement based on an iShare sort of template participant agreement?
Interesting. Yes. No, so iShare is actually on. So now maybe a bit on legal side of how the iShare framework operates and how it gives you the legal guarantees in terms of when you are doing the exchange using the framework. iShare is essentially a multilateral contract. So when you are actually a user of iShare and you sign the terms of use agreement by signing the accession agreement for iShare, that's a very general umbrella agreement where that binds you, or that you are signing as an obligation that you will follow the perspectives of iShare framework, and you will oblige that when data is shared using the framework and the conditions that are applying, digitally shared conditions, you will oblige by those conditions from other participants. That's the essential agreement that we have, and that forms the basis even for all the ecosystems federations to build on top. So the iShare framework agreements are basically the base layer, and on top, the specific ones within the sector can have additional agreements or additional legal requirements,
Mm.
regulatory requirements. Those all sit on the top. And then in a specific ecosystem, you will have participants which cater to iShare plus the ecosystem specifics. And that is how you can see at what level in legal terms they are uh, completely compliant to or adhering to.
So you said there's three levels of federation. Then there's one with iShare, sort of a base, and then there's a ecosystem, and then there might be a specific federation. So just to make this as a real example, in aerospace, for example, you might have an a let's say an aerospace federation, but then maybe you have a specific federation just around engines, around yeah, something like that.
Yes, that can be. If the market needs it like that, then yes. Or if a subsector within a sector needs, a lot of differences in how they operate and how they work,
Mm-hmm.
or they have more regulatory or other kind of aspects that they need to cover on a general level, then we see that they will come together for creating such kind of agreements.
Was there
Um,
any example of this in logistics? Because since we talked about that initially, did they have any sub sectors
yes,
or sub organizations?
Yes, actually they do, because logistics in a broader level is actually multimodal, but each modality, like marine transport or road transport, rail transport,
Right.
these are all different modalities, and they have their own specifics as well.
Mm.
And in fact, they also use different data standards and other kinds of standards that they are applying on.
Yeah.
Also, because air industry and road transport will not have the same legal requirements and those kind of things. So those will be catered into their own specifics, whereas overall logistics, it needs to happen on a multimodality, because uh, transporting good from point A to point B will require that you switch between modality, unless it's a very local transport, of course. I hope that answers.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's good to have the concrete example. So you mentioned that iShare is governed by the participants. We mentioned logistics. What are some of the other larger participants, I guess, in iShare itself that that are getting a lot of value out of this?
Yes, so iShare is used in energy, in construction, in agriculture, in tourism, in smart cities, smart environments. Yeah, and these are top of my head, but yeah, we are expanding in more and more sectors and regions. And some of these actual initiatives also include the national government's aspects as well. Like Green Deal, where we are also in Green Deal, where governments wants to have access to um, energy consumption data or CO2 emissions data, and they are actually creating such an ecosystem where participants can specifically share some of the data on specifics so that they can get the analysis on the usage or carbon emissions or energy consumption to bring the statistics in terms of how the carbon footprint of that country or region looks like. So yeah, these are a few of the examples that I can bring up.
Yeah, people take these statistics for granted, but it takes some work to get the data flowing to understand them.
Yeah.
So it sounds like a lot of this is legal. How do we ensure compliance? Like, so if my company shares data with you, how do we know that the data wasn't shared? Is there any mechanism for that, for reporting or audit, or how do I know that you actually did what you said you did with the data?
Yeah, so in terms of actual data sharing, that's a transaction that we encourage to happen more peer-to-peer, because the idea is that you have more control over, and you don't need a third party to control who has access to your data. However, of course, in reality, when data sharing happens, you need to log and monitor all the transactions that are happening. And there are service providers which actually actively log every transaction. And through our framework, we provide guidance in terms of how do you make the proofs that are actually also utilizable later on, even for legal purposes, that such transaction actually occurred, and that happens on both sides, or using a third party as an intermediary where the logging happens, and that can happen. That can actually can be used to prove. Also to monitor on technical level, you could also trigger events based on such events when data sharing is happening, and use those events to keep track of when actually data sharing is happening or not.
So potentially, an enterprise might want to receive like a stream of decisions
Mhm.
from and then do and like maybe even intrusion detection or violation detection, or just in general just sort of real-time analyze if they like the data sharing that's or the data use that's going on, something like that.
Mhm.
The decision logs aren't really standardized. Have you seen any examples of the ecosystem saying like this is what a log looks like? Because if everybody's sending different looking logs, wouldn't that be a challenge?
Yes, indeed, it's not standardized, and I think the way at least we have seen so far is that it's not done usually at the ecosystem level. That's only done when there is more like a regulatory requirement or more standardized requirement on that ecosystem level where all participants must adhere to. But on the other cases where it's purely between some of the participants, they tend to agree on their own whether to use an existing standard or to based on their implementations if they have something specific implemented. Of course, that means less interoperability, but then if there are existing implementations, then they tend to go more towards that direction instead of adopting a different standard. So
Um,
not solving the fragmentation. I get the point.
yeah. Well, I think there's some room for standard decision logs, especially if we're going to do automated detection. If we can get the more data we can get into common schema. Um, or even what's included. Maybe there's an order number or a tracking number. You want to make sure that for your ecosystem that ticket ID or whatever is going to be in there. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And I actually wanted to talk about the JWTs themselves, because it sounds like at the heart of your idea, we have these, signed pieces of JSON being issued.
Yeah.
Who are the issuers here, and how do they customize these JWTs to conform with, or can you share your experience about like who are the issuers and who are the consumers of the JWTs here?
Yes. So what we have done is, in the framework, we have defined a role model. And in the role model, we define specific roles that parties can play. We call it roles because it can be same participant doing multiple roles, or each party doing a separate role. So there is a
Right.
flexibility in that
We
perspective.
see that in the banking ecosystem too. There's like I forget the terms that they use, but there's like the term for the bank, and then there's the term for the fintech company or the payment processor. So those
Yeah.
types of not the person's roles,
Yes.
but you're saying like the industries, that organization's role in the ecosystem, right?
Yes, indeed. So we have created that kind of a role model, and then per use case you apply, okay, who plays what role in a
Mm-hmm.
specific transaction, and then it becomes easier to explain who is the issuer, who is the subject, and who is actually sharing the data, who is consuming the data, and things like that. So what we have done is we have defined service consumer, service provider as two roles, which are actually involved in data exchange. We call it
Mm-hmm.
service provider because the party who provides a service for sending the data or receiving the data,
Yeah.
and the data consumer who is basically service consumer who is actually consuming that service that is provided by the provider.
Yeah.
uh, and
It's the thing is that we don't have enough words, and so a lot of these words get reused, and
yes,
it can be. So in your case, the service provider would be like a company providing an API for access to data, and the consumer would be the person calling the API, right?
yeah, the organization or person calling the API. But only those two doesn't help, of course.
Yeah.
Um, um, there is one aspect that we haven't talked about, and in specifically in terms of authorization, is maybe that is first better to explain that first. Is what do we expect, and the way we enable authorizations is actually on multiple levels. So as a service provider who is exposing an API over some set of data, of course it has its own existing authorization over that data, because if you take an example of a service provider exposing, say, what would be a good example?
Order
Let's say,
API.
sorry.
Or an order API.
Yeah, an order API. Okay, then it's an commerce organization taking order API, exposing the order API. If it is an ERP system, you have a tenancy in that ERP system of a specific commerce company or manufacturer or whoever is that
Mm-hmm.
company is. So of course that party has the first right from that service provider perspective. So that is the level 0, of course, in multi-tenant organizations, specifically if you talk in terms of cloud service providers. And the tenant to whom that particular tenancy belongs is the primary owner of the data set in that tenancy. And they must make the decision in order to share access to their APIs to somebody else. In terms of authorization, that we additionally define a role called authorization registry. And again, this can be an external party, or the same party, or even the tenant itself, whose tenancy is there. It could play the role, and it defines additional authorizations in terms of who has access to that data that it actually owns. So there is level 0 authorization, that is because it is my tenant, the data is sitting in my tenancy, it is my data, and then I'm going to share that access to that data to somebody else. And this is where I define all the policies for access. And that can be an external component, external role provided by a third party organization. and it can have further delegations down the line. So that's the role that we define. And in that situation, what happens is, as you can imagine, if it is just the data rights holder, as in the first place, who is the tenant or owner, issues the authorization to the service consumer, then the issuer will be the tenant, and the subject will be the service consumer, and resource will be specifically on which data set or which API it is giving access to. So that's a basic model that you will have. But in case of delegations, like, as a tenant, I give, say, you the rights, Mike, but you don't do that work yourself, you further subcontract it, then it goes to yet another party, and that party actually is the service consumer in the end, because it can also have access to the data at the source now, and all you need to do is just put a delegation. So then we form a delegation chain. So I give you rights, and then you give that party, the service consumer, rights, and then using that, the service consumer can go to the service provider, get the access, and the service provider can then actually evaluate the chain and determine, yes, this can work, or the party is authorized, so then it can allow access to the data.
Sorry, the sun is starting to encroach on your. Maybe it might be a good time to tactically.
I hope this solves this.
Yeah, way better. You were getting sort of like a godlike halo, which I think is appropriate for your knowledge, but maybe distracting to the audience. Yeah, so that's very interesting. So basically, the person when we say person, we're really talking about an enterprise or an organization participant, let's say, who's issuing the token to somebody to consume. It sounds a lot like an access token, and like, we're not talking about humans here. We're talking about enterprises. And what types of standards are used by the issuers today? Like, what's the range? Like, are we seeing OAuth or OpenID or SAML or a mix? What are sort of the trends you see in this area?
Yeah, maybe I'll get back to your question in a bit, because I also heard an interesting comment from you. One aspect that is different from typical OAuth that we are following, because we also rely on OAuth standard, or we have used OAuth standard and for doing the identification aspect. And typically OAuth also includes the authorization of the identity that you have just established. This is where we differ. We have decoupled that. So we only use the OAuth part for identification and authentication aspects. And the authorizations actually are a second step, which happens just in time when actual data exchange or data sharing is happening. So I first do an identification and authentication, and then when I call specific API, at that time, the determination happens whether I am allowed or not. And then it can be an organization or an person, and it can happen through this so-called authorization registry tool, where the request is sent. So there are two patterns as well here. One is that the service provider itself checks at the authorization registry by asking specifically of if this particular identity, which is acting as subject, has access to certain resource, whose owner is this, so the issuer is then known. So using all of that information, it can actually form that question and sends that question to the authorization registry. And the authorization registry, based on the policies that are registered in it, it can determine whether such an access is allowed or not. And it sends then the authorization token, which is a signed JWT, which is signed by the authorization registry itself. So then that is a signature that you can rely on, because then there are
that's really interesting.
It's verified token. The other pattern is that instead of service provider asking it to authorization registry, the service consumer actually can directly do that with authorization registry, receive it as a token. This is quite a lot like what we in today's world see verifiable credentials, but we developed this method already before verifiable credentials came in. So, but it's essentially the same concept there. So you actually go to authorization registry as consumer, You get the token, a signed token from it that you have access to certain resource from certain issuer, and then present it along to the service provider along with your request. And that using that, then provider can evaluate the authorization, and then you have access to it.
So when they present this authorization service JWT, do they also present their client credentials, or do they say, here's my token that proves my client identity, and here's my authorization token that proves that I should have access? So are they presenting to the API, let's say, what you're calling the service provider? Are they providing more than one JWT? Or they just provide the one authorization JWT, which includes the identity check?
Yeah, so far the implementations are basically two-step process. So they are the identification authentication happens before any kind of request to data can happen. The primary reason is that we don't want the loop of identification authentication every time you want to access the data. So if it is one-time access, yeah, it of course in those cases it is a bit disadvantageous. But if we expect that a lot of organizations want to have access to more and more services from you, then you just do the identification authentication once. Then in return you get a token, and that is the token which is just your a token which is only your verified identification, but it doesn't give you any kind of authorization. And then every time you send a request of for specific data, the authorization is checked at that time.
Right. Interesting. Well, that makes sense. Well, I think, we're actually a little over on time, which is unusual, but let's go into last thoughts. I mean, we can't cover all of iShare in one episode, but what are some of the takeaways for you, for the audience, about iShare?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so like I was explaining, the aim of iShare as a foundation, as a framework, is it wants to enable data rights holder to have access to have control over their data, and to share the data selectively to right parties, and also keep control over what they can do with the data. So in that perspective, if you are looking for cross organization data sharing and controls, iShare is the place you should look at. Specifically, evaluate the framework, check for its fit. It's a neutral entity, and also governed by our own participants. So if you are participant of iShare, you also take part into our governance and help us further evolve how the framework should be developed. That's essentially with the key purpose that we want to enable the organizations who are data rights holder.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this information about iShare. It's really fascinating. There's so much overlap between the work we've done in the banking sector and higher education and what you're doing, and it's really interesting to see how iShare sort of taken it one level further and said, okay, really access control is what's important, and let's move that forward. So I think it's super interesting, and I think a lot of organizations or ecosystems should look at this. So briefly, let me announce the next episode: patterns and anti-patterns in privilege access management. And that's on Thursday. We also have an episode on Friday today. We have a makeup episode about least standing privilege, I think, or continuous authentication. So join us both Thursday and Friday this week. With that, I'll say thank you to Rajiv, and thank you to our audience, and we'll see you next time.
I would say thank you, Mike, for giving me this opportunity, and thank you, audience, for joining and listening to me. I really appreciate that.
Okay.